The wooden toboggan leaned against the cabin wall, a thing of smooth planed pine meant for hauling firewood, not people. For Silas Blackwood, it was a contradiction made of timber and rope. It was a tool of self-reliance, yet its presence now reminded him of the one thing he could not haul, fix, or fight on his own, the woman inside his cabin. Her name was May, and she was the last thing a man who'd chosen the company of mountains over men ever wanted. Silas was a man built of the same materials as his surroundings, rock and pine and hard winter frost. His shoulders were as broad as an axe handle is long, and a thick dark beard fell to his chest, hiding a mouth that rarely smiled. He had come to this lonely peak in the Montana Territory in 1878 to escape the noise of the world, building a life with his own two calloused hands. He had a claim on 160 acres of unforgiving stone and timber, a deed filed with the territorial clerk, and a profound desire to be left alone. Therefore, the arrival of Mayor Thompson's man 2 weeks prior, leading a single tired horse with a small woman on its back, had felt like a violation. The mayor's letter, delivered with the woman, was blunt. Silas had cleared the town of the Corrigan gang the previous year, a bloody affair that the territorial marshal had been happy to let a mountain man handle. The town of Redemption, nestled in the valley below, owed him. But Redemption was cash poor. What it did have was a problem. A young Chinese woman left behind when the railroad crews moved east. She had no family, no papers anyone cared to read, and no prospects. The mayor, in his infinite wisdom, saw a solution that solved two problems at once. He called her unfortunate, but capable. He called the arrangement a settlement of his debt to Silas. He called it a kindness. Silas called it an intrusion. He'd watched her slide off the horse. She was small, swallowed by an old gray dress that seemed too thin for the mountain air. The only color on her was a worn red scarf wrapped around her neck. She didn't look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on the packed earth in front of his cabin. The mayor's man had grunted, handed Silas the letter, and left before the silence could get any more awkward. And now she was here. A ghost at his table, a shadow by his fire. Winter was already whispering down from the high peaks, and Silas Blackwood was trapped. He looked at the toboggan, then at the heavy gray sky, and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He had a debt to collect, but he wasn't at all sure this was payment. The first days were a contest of silence. Silas moved through his world with the deliberate, heavy force of a bear preparing for hibernation. He split wood, the axe falling with a percussive crack that echoed off the granite cliffs. He checked his trap lines, returning with skinned rabbits and beaver pelts that he prepared with grim efficiency. He spoke only when necessary, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very timbers of the cabin. There's the woodpile. The water bucket needs filling. Don't touch the rifles. May, in turn, moved with the quiet swiftness of a field mouse. She seemed to take up no space at all, her footsteps barely registering on the rough-hewn floorboards. She cooked the rabbits he brought in, adding bitter herbs she'd carried in a small cloth bundle, turning his bland survival fare into something savory and warming. She mended a tear in his winter coat with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She did not speak unless spoken to, and when she did, her voice was soft, her English careful and precise. But her silence was different from his. His was a wall. Hers felt more like a deep, still pool of water. Silas didn't know which was more unnerving. He had tried to send her back. On the third day, he'd packed a small bundle of food, slung it over his shoulder, and told her, "Get your things. I'm taking you to Redemption." She had been cleaning a pot by the fire, and she simply stopped, her hands motionless in the murky water. She looked up at him, and for the first time he met her gaze directly. Her eyes were dark and unreadable. "Mayor Thompson will not have me," she said, her voice even. "The town will not have me. Where will you take me?" The question was simple, but it struck him like a physical blow. He had no answer. Leave her on the steps of the general store? Abandon her at the saloon? He was a man who solved problems with his hands or with the cold steel of a hunting knife. This was a problem of a different sort. It had a face and a quiet voice. He stood there, a giant of a man rendered helpless by a single logical question. Therefore he turned without a word, walked out the door, and spent the rest of the day hunting, pushing himself until his muscles burned and his lungs ached, trying to sweat out the frustration. But when he returned, the cabin was warm. The smell of stew filled the air, and she was there, a silent reproach to his own brutishness. The first real snow came not as a gentle dusting, but as an invading army. It began in the afternoon, thick, wet flakes that clung to the pines and turned the world a uniform, suffocating white. Silas had been tracking a bull elk for 2 days, needing the meat to see them through the deep winter. He knew the signs. The air had grown heavy and still, the squirrels had vanished, and the wind had died to a whisper. It was the mountain holding its breath before the storm broke. He should have turned back, but his pride, that stubborn and foolish companion, urged him on. He was Silas Blackwood. He knew this mountain better than he knew any human face. He would not be chased home by a flurry. But it was not a flurry. The sky opened, and the world disappeared. The wind rose from a whisper to a howl, driving snow so thick he couldn't see the trees 10 feet in front of him. Disoriented, he lost the elk's tracks, then his own. Every direction looked the same, a churning vortex of white. The temperature plummeted. The cold, which had been a familiar companion, became a predator. It bit at his exposed skin, seeped through his thick coat, and began its slow, methodical work on his bones. He pushed on, believing his internal compass, the one that had never failed him, would guide him home. He stumbled, his foot catching on a root hidden beneath the fresh powder. He went down hard, his head striking a rock he never saw. The world flared with a brief, bright pain, and then it began to fade, the howling wind softening into a lullaby. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs felt heavy, disconnected. A strange warmth spread through him, a pleasant, drowsy feeling he knew was a liar. This is how a man dies on a mountain, he thought with a curious detachment, not in a fight, but in a quiet, white sleep. His last coherent thought was not of survival, but of the woman in his cabin. He had left the wood box only half full. He woke to a singular sharp pain in his cheek. It happened again. A slap. Not hard, but insistent. His eyes fluttered open. The world was a blur of white, but there was a slash of crimson in the middle of it. The red scarf. May was kneeling over him, her face raw from the wind, her small hands slapping his face with a desperate rhythm. She was shouting something, but the wind tore the words away. He saw her lips form his name. Silas! He tried to speak, but his jaw was locked with cold. He could only manage a groan. Her expression, which had been frantic, softened with a flicker of relief, but there was no time for it. She grabbed the collar of his coat, her strength astonishing for her size, and tried to pull him. He was a dead weight, a felled tree. He was too big, too heavy. He saw the despair in her eyes as she strained, her boots slipping in the snow. Then she stopped. Her gaze went past him, and a new idea seemed to take hold. She disappeared from his view, and he heard a scraping sound. When she returned, she was dragging the wooden toboggan. The toboggan. The one he'd built to haul firewood. She looped a length of rope under his arms, her fingers nimble despite the brutal cold. She positioned the toboggan beside him, and then, using every ounce of her will, she managed to roll his enormous, uncooperative body onto the narrow plank of wood. It was a feat of leverage and sheer determination that should have been impossible. The journey back was a nightmare he witnessed in flashes. The world was a sea of white. The only constant was the small, determined figure in front of him, leaning into the wind, the rope biting into her shoulder, pulling him one agonizing inch at a time. He saw her fall, disappear into a drift, and then rise again, shaking the snow from her shoulders like a dog. She never looked back. She just kept pulling. The red scarf was her banner, a fragile flag of defiance against the storm. He drifted in and out of consciousness, the rhythmic pull of the rope a strange, hypnotic heartbeat. He was being saved by the woman he had tried to cast out, hauled home like a sack of feed on a tool of his own making. The irony was so sharp it felt like a shard of ice in his gut. The last thing he remembered was the scent of pine smoke and the blessed, incredible warmth of the cabin. Then, darkness took him completely. He came back to the world slowly, piece by piece. First came the sound, the steady crackle of a well-fed fire. Then the feeling of rough wool blankets piled high on top of him. Finally, the pain. A dull, throbbing ache in his head and a sharp, biting fire in the toes of his right foot. He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness pushed him back down. "Be still," a soft voice commanded. May was sitting in a chair by the hearth, her silhouette framed by the firelight. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes were alert. A pot was simmering over the flames, filling the small cabin with the rich scent of broth. She rose and came to his bedside, a steaming mug in her hands. "Drink this," she said. He obeyed without question, the man who never took orders from anyone. She had to hold the mug for him, tipping it to his lips. His hands shook too much to hold it himself. The broth was hot and salty, and it felt like life itself pouring back into him. When he was done, she set the mug aside and gently pulled back the blankets from his feet. His left foot was red and swollen, but his right was a waxy, corpse-like white. Frostbite. A death sentence for a man's toes on a mountain. He had seen men lose feet, lose legs to that dead white cold. "It is bad," he rasped, his voice raw. "I've been packing it in snow," she said, her voice calm and clinical, "to warm it slowly. The sudden heat of the fire is worse. My father was a healer in our village. He taught me." She had built a small mound of snow in a wooden basin and was carefully, methodically packing it around his afflicted foot. Her touch was gentle but firm, her movements precise. She was not a frightened girl. She was a physician at work. Silas lay back, watching her. This small, silent woman had tracked him in a blizzard that should have killed them both, hauled his 200-pound frame through waist-deep snow, and now was tending to his wounds with a skill he had never witnessed. They stayed like that for what felt like hours. The only sounds, the fire and the whisper of the wind, now dying, outside the cabin walls. The pain in his foot began to change, from a numb cold to 1,000 burning needles. It was agony, but he knew from old stories that pain was a good sign. Pain meant the life was coming back. "Why?" he finally managed to ask. The question hung in the warm air between them. "Why did you come for me?" She did not look up from her work. "The wood box was half empty," she said simply. "You would not leave it so if you planned to be gone long. The storm came. You did not." It was so logical, so practical, it disarmed him. He had expected some appeal to sentiment, some declaration of duty. Instead, she had offered an observation, a simple, irrefutable fact. He was a creature of habit, and she had read his habits like a book. "You could have died out there," he said, the words costing him more than he cared to admit. She paused, her hand stilling on his foot. She finally looked at him, her dark eyes holding his. "To be alone in a cabin with enough food for the winter is not death," she said. "To be alone in a blizzard with no shelter, that is death." It was a simple choice. There it was again, her simple, direct clarity. It cut through his pride, his anger, his resentment, and laid the truth bare. In a world of brutal choices, she had made the one that favored life. Not just her life, but his. Later that night, as she changed the dressing on his head wound, he found the courage to ask the other question. "The mayor's letter, it said you were unfortunate." May's hands paused for a fraction of a second. She finished tying the bandage before she answered, her back mostly to him as she tidied the supplies. "My husband was killed in a rock slide working on the railroad," she said, her voice flat, devoid of self-pity. "We had only been married for 3 months. In his country, a widow has a place. In this one, a Chinese widow with no family is baggage. Unfortunate." She turned to face him, her expression not sad but weary, as if explaining the obvious to a child. "Mayor Thompson did not know what to do with me. The men in the town, they looked at me with pity, or with hunger. The women looked at me with suspicion. The mayor owed you a debt. Sending me here was tidy." He cleared his books. Silas felt a profound shame settle over him, heavier than the snow on his roof. He had seen her as a burden, an intrusion. He had accepted the town's label for her, unfortunate, broken, without a second thought. But she wasn't broken. She had been widowed. She had been abandoned. She had survived. He, the great, self-sufficient mountain man, had nearly been killed by his own arrogance. She, the unfortunate piece of baggage, had saved him with her courage and her knowledge. Everything he thought he knew had been turned on its head. "He called you capable," Silas said quietly. "He was right about that." A small, sad smile touched her lips for the first time. "He was right about many things he did not understand." The winter deepened, locking them in a world of white and silence. But the silence was different now. It was no longer a wall between them, but a space they shared. Silas's recovery was slow. The pain in his foot was a constant, throbbing reminder of his foolishness. He was humbled, forced into a state of dependence he despised. He couldn't split wood, couldn't hunt. He could only sit by the fire, his foot propped up, and watch. And what he watched changed him. He watched May move through the cabin, her grace and efficiency a quiet marvel. He saw how she never wasted emotion, how she could make a meal for 2 out of a single rabbit and a handful of dried roots. He learned that her father hadn't just been a healer, but a scholar. She could read, not just her own language, but English as well. A fact she revealed one evening when she picked up his worn copy of a book and read a passage aloud to fill the quiet. He began to talk. At first it was just to ask questions. He asked about the herbs she used, about her home, about the father who had taught her so much. She answered in her simple, direct way, painting a picture of a life so different from his own, yet bound by the same truths of hardship and survival. In return, he found himself telling her things he had never told another soul. He told her about the war that had soured him on the company of men, about the peace he'd sought and found in the high, lonely places. One afternoon she was outside clearing a path to the woodpile with a shovel, her slight frame struggling against the deep drifts. He watched from the doorway, a knot of frustration in his gut at his own uselessness. He saw her slip and fall, disappearing for a moment in the soft powder. He started forward, a useless gesture, but she was already getting up, brushing herself off, her red scarf a bright splash against the snow. She didn't look annoyed or defeated, just determined. When she came back inside, her cheeks flushed with cold, he spoke without thinking. You should have my coat. It's warmer." She looked at her own thin gray dress, then at him. "And you would sit by the fire in your shirt? We share the work, we share the warmth. It is the only way to survive." It was her philosophy for everything. Simple, practical, true. He was beginning to understand that he had not been sent a burden. He had been sent a partner. The mayor, in his clumsy attempt to settle a debt, had accidentally given Silas the one thing he didn't know he needed. The winter passed, not in days or weeks, but in shared tasks and quiet conversations. He taught her the names of the constellations in the clear, cold night sky. She taught him how to weave cordage from plant fibers that was stronger than his rope. His foot healed, the toes scarred and tender, but his own. Her quiet presence became not an intrusion, but the very center of his world. By the time the spring thaw finally came, melting the great drifts and turning the mountain paths into muddy streams, the cabin was a different place. It was no longer just his shelter, but their home. A small, sturdy table stood in the center of the room, one he had built under her direction. The shelves were stocked with smoked meat and jars of preserved berries. There was a neatness, an order, that had never existed when he lived there alone. The unspoken arrangement of master and servant was gone, replaced by the easy rhythm of two people who knew each other's habits and trusted each other's strengths. In late April, Silas looked up from the corral he was repairing to see a rider making his way up the trail. It was Mayor Thompson. He rode with the self-important air of a man checking on an investment. He dismounted, his eyes sweeping over the homestead, taking in the tidy wood pile, the repaired fence, the smoke curling lazily from the chimney. "Blackwood," he said, nodding. "Good to see you survived the winter. I came to see how my arrangement was working out." He peered toward the cabin, a smirk on his face. Before Silas could answer, the cabin door opened. May stepped out, carrying 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She wore the same gray dress, but it was clean and mended. The red scarf was tied neatly in her hair. She walked directly to the mayor, her back straight, and handed him a mug. She met his gaze without fear or deference. "Good morning, Mayor Thompson," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It is a long ride. You must be thirsty." The mayor was so taken aback he simply took the mug. He looked from her to Silas, his expression a mixture of confusion and surprise. He had delivered a piece of unfortunate baggage, and he had found a homesteader. He saw not a master and a servant, but a man and a woman standing together on their own land. Silas stepped forward and stood beside May. He didn't put a hand on her or make any grand gesture. He just stood there, his presence a silent declaration. "The debt is paid, Mayor," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "You can tell the folks in Redemption that." The mayor stammered, drank his coffee too quickly, and made his excuses. As he rode away, Silas watched him go, a feeling of quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. The world's judgment had been rendered, and it had been found wanting. He turned to May. She was looking at him, a question in her eyes. He reached out and gently touched the red scarf in her hair. "My father gave it to me," she said softly. "He said red is the color of luck and of life." Silas looked around at the mountain, alive with the sounds of spring, at the cabin that was finally a home, and at the woman who had made it so. He thought of the toboggan, still leaning against the cabin wall. It wasn't just a tool for hauling wood anymore. It was a monument, a reminder that a man's strength isn't measured by what he can carry alone, but by who he is willing to be carried by. And sometimes, the very thing you think will break you is the only thing that can make you whole.